She said yes to my proposal, then her friends made her give back the ring 20 minutes later. I spent 4 months planning what I thought would be the perfect proposal for Hazel at the Interactive Science Museum in Portland, the same place where we'd had our first date during a robotics exhibition 2 years earlier. I wanted it to be meaningful, not just expensive, so I secretly collaborated with a local tech artist named Marcus to create an interactive holographic display that would tell our love story through augmented reality. The planning process had been incredibly detailed. I'd worked with Marcus every Tuesday evening after my shifts at the software development firm, programming the installation to incorporate digital recreations of our most important moments. The display would show our first meeting at a coding boot camp where we debugged each other's projects until midnight, virtual tours of our shared apartment where we'd built a smart home system together, and even recreations of the coffee shop where we'd spent countless Sunday mornings discussing everything from quantum computing to sustainable architecture. I coordinated with Dr. Sarah Chin, the museum curator, to have the display ready during their evening gala, timing everything perfectly so the holographic projection would activate just as Hazel and I approached the main exhibit hall. The technical specifications alone had taken weeks to perfect: motion sensors, projection mapping, synchronized audio that would trigger when we entered the designated zone. When she saw her own memories floating in three-dimensional light around us, showing our journey from strangers to partners to something deeper, her face lit up with genuine amazement at the technical artistry and emotional thought I'd put into every detail of the moment. The custom-designed smart ring I'd commissioned from a local jeweler who specialized in tech-integrated pieces could sync with our shared devices and home automation system, representing how our lives had become beautifully integrated through technology and mutual respect. I'd even programmed it to display her favorite constellation pattern when connected to our smart home's lighting system. When I knelt down in front of that glowing display with dozens of other gala attendees watching, she said yes immediately, tears streaming down her face as she laughed with pure joy and examined the ring's elegant programming features. She kept saying she couldn't believe I'd managed to keep such an elaborate project secret, marveling at how the holographic timeline captured moments she'd forgotten we'd even shared. For exactly 20 minutes, I felt like the luckiest person alive, watching her show the holographic display to other guests and explaining how we'd built our relationship on shared passions for innovation and problem-solving. Dr. Chen complimented us on being the most genuinely compatible couple she'd seen use the museum's space for proposals. Then her 3 friends Brooklyn, Scarlett, and Willow arrived unexpectedly, claiming they were just in the neighborhood, despite never showing the slightest interest in science exhibits or technology demonstrations before that evening. The timing felt oddly coincidental since they'd specifically declined when Hazel had invited them to previous museum events with us. The moment they appeared, something shifted in Hazel's expression from radiant happiness to nervous uncertainty, and I watched her unconsciously step closer to them while her hand moved protectively over the ring as if she already sensed what was coming next. Brooklyn immediately pulled Hazel aside with that urgent whisper tone she used whenever she wanted to create drama, claiming they needed an emergency bathroom conversation that couldn't wait another minute. I watched the 3 of them surround Hazel like a protective barrier, their body language screaming intervention rather than congratulations, while I stood there holding champagne glasses feeling increasingly awkward as the minutes stretched on. Dr. Chen tried to make polite conversation about the technical aspects of the holographic display, and Marcus complimented the precision of the motion tracking calibration, but I could barely focus on their words while wondering what exactly was happening in that bathroom. 25 minutes passed before they emerged, and the change in Hazel was immediately devastating. Her makeup was completely ruined, mascara streaked down her cheeks, and her hands were visibly trembling as she walked toward me with the mechanical movements of someone who'd been thoroughly convinced to do something against their instincts. She approached me with Brooklyn flanking her on the left and Scarlett positioned on the right like bodyguards, while Willow hung back recording the entire interaction on her phone for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. When Hazel extended her hand with my ring sitting in her palm, her voice sounded completely robotic as she recited what were obviously scripted words about how her friends had helped her realize we weren't compatible for long-term commitment and that she needed to focus on personal growth instead of settling into comfortable patterns. I listened to this rehearsed speech while staring at the ring that had taken me weeks to design and program, knowing that every word coming out of her mouth belonged to Brooklyn rather than reflecting Hazel's actual thoughts or feelings. The entire scene felt surreal, standing next to my elaborate holographic love story while the woman I'd planned to marry handed back the symbol of our future because her friends had convinced her during a 25-minute bathroom session that 2 years of building something meaningful together was somehow a mistake. I could have argued or demanded explanations or pointed out how manipulative the timing was, but instead I simply told her it was her choice to make and calmly took the ring back without any dramatic protests or emotional manipulation tactics. The 3 friends looked almost disappointed by my composed response, like they'd been expecting tears or anger or begging that would validate their narrative about me being desperate or controlling. I walked away from the holographic display that would forever remind her of what she'd thrown away, leaving behind the interactive installation that Marcus and I had spent months perfecting because forcing her to confront her choice seemed unnecessarily cruel. The drive to my brother Logan's apartment passed in complete silence while I processed the shock of having my entire future dismantled by people who'd never bothered to understand what Hazel and I had actually built together. And I spent that weekend sitting in Logan's guest room trying to comprehend how something so carefully planned and genuinely meaningful could be destroyed so quickly by outside interference that had nothing to do with our actual compatibility or shared goals. Within 3 weeks, I accepted a position as a virtual reality development specialist with Next Gen Gaming Solutions, a cutting-edge company in Seattle that specialized in therapeutic VR applications for trauma recovery and anxiety treatment. The job offer had been sitting in my inbox for 2 months, but I'd ignored it because Hazel and I had been building our life in Portland together, planning weekend trips to Mount Hood and discussing which neighborhood we'd buy our first house in after getting married. Now the opportunity felt like exactly the escape I needed from Portland's toxic social dynamics and the constant reminders of what I'd lost to her friends' manipulation. I spent those 3 weeks systematically dismantling my Portland existence, selling my high-end gaming setup and VR equipment to fund the move, breaking my lease early despite the penalty fees, and deleting every trace of social media that connected me to Hazel's circle of friends. Logan helped me pack my entire apartment into a moving truck, commenting on how efficiently I was cutting all ties instead of lingering in false hope that Hazel might change her mind once the initial drama wore off. Meanwhile, Brooklyn, Scarlett, and Willow were initially celebrating their supposed victory in saving Hazel from what they called settling for someone boring and predictable, throwing themselves congratulatory dinners and posting social media stories about protecting friends from making life-altering mistakes. Their celebration felt increasingly hollow as they watched Hazel sink deeper into depression over the following weeks, declining their group activities and sitting silently during forced coffee meetups while they tried to convince her she'd made the right choice. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd stopped participating in their usual weekend plans and spent most evenings alone in her apartment, staring at photos from our relationship and questioning whether she'd destroyed something genuinely good for reasons that made less sense with each passing day. When Brooklyn casually mentioned during one of their forced social gatherings that I was permanently relocating to Seattle rather than just taking a temporary break from Portland, Hazel had a complete emotional breakdown at their favorite coffee shop, sobbing uncontrollably as the finality of my decision hit her and she realized I wasn't coming back to fight for our relationship. Her friends tried damage control by insisting long-distance relationships never worked anyway and that Seattle's tech scene was notoriously superficial, but their hollow reassurances only made her cry harder as she processed that I'd been serious about building a future together while they'd convinced her it was all just comfortable mediocrity. By the time my moving truck crossed the Oregon-Washington border, I was already thriving in Seattle's innovative tech environment, working with brilliant colleagues on VR therapy applications that helped veterans process PTSD and children overcome medical procedure anxiety through immersive positive experiences. 2 years later, I met Iris Chen at a sustainable technology conference in downtown Seattle where she was presenting her research on using smart sensors to optimize urban energy consumption for carbon footprint reduction. She was a sustainable urban planning consultant who specialized in integrating environmental monitoring systems with city infrastructure, and I was immediately drawn to her passionate presentation about using technology to solve real-world environmental problems rather than just entertainment or profit. During the networking session, we discovered a shared fascination with using data visualization to make complex environmental issues more accessible to the general public, and our conversation naturally evolved from professional interests to personal values about making meaningful contributions to society. What struck me most about Iris was how confidently she formed her own opinions about everything from renewable energy policy to urban development strategies, never once checking her phone to see what friends thought or deferring to group consensus before expressing her views. She made decisions independently based on research and personal convictions, approaching problems with analytical thinking and genuine curiosity rather than seeking external validation for every choice. Our relationship developed organically through collaborative projects where we worked together on smart city initiatives, designing integrated systems that combined my VR modeling expertise with her urban planning knowledge to create immersive presentations for city councils considering environmental upgrades. I felt profound relief being with someone who contributed equally to our conversations instead of just waiting for her turn to talk about herself, who asked thoughtful questions about my therapeutic VR applications for trauma patients and offered insights about how environmental stress might factor into treatment protocols. When I posted photos from our weekend research trip to Vancouver's Sustainable Architecture Conference where we'd been documenting green building sensor implementations, I felt genuinely content-sharing experiences with someone who supported my professional interests instead of seeing them as competition for attention. Through mutual college connections, Hazel eventually discovered my social media presence and saw how naturally happy I looked collaborating with someone who shared my values about using technology for meaningful purposes rather than just personal advancement. She showed the Vancouver conference photos to her remaining friend group, though their dynamic had shifted considerably after months of watching Hazel struggle with depression and regret over the museum incident. Brooklyn, Scarlett, and Willow immediately went into damage control mode, criticizing Iris's appearance as too serious and academic, insisting that rebound relationships built on shared work projects never lasted because they lacked real emotional connection and passion. But Hazel was finally beginning to recognize their transparent jealousy and defensive patterns, realizing that her friends consistently sabotaged her happiness whenever she found someone who treated her well because their own relationship failures made them resent seeing others succeed where they'd repeatedly crashed and burned. 3 years after leaving Portland, I proposed to Iris during a sunset drone photography session we'd planned together at Seattle's waterfront, using our shared hobby of aerial documentation to capture the city's evolving skyline while discussing how urban development could better incorporate environmental sustainability principles. The proposal felt natural and collaborative rather than theatrical. I designed a custom eco-friendly lab-grown diamond ring that reflected her environmental values, and when I knelt down beside our drone equipment as the golden hour light painted Elliott Bay, she laughed with pure joy before enthusiastically saying yes while examining the ring's ethical sourcing documentation. Our engagement photos captured two people working seamlessly together to pilot camera drones and document the city's architectural evolution, showing the kind of genuine partnership where both people contributed equally to creating something beautiful rather than one person performing for the other's entertainment. Our wedding planning reflected our shared values about sustainability and meaningful celebration rather than expensive spectacle. We researched venues that used renewable energy, selected caterers who sourced ingredients locally, and chose decorations that could be composted or repurposed instead of contributing to landfill waste. When Hazel discovered our engagement announcement through the same mutual college connections that had originally exposed my Seattle success, she realized with devastating clarity that I had found exactly what we could have had together if she trusted her own feelings instead of surrendering to her friends' manipulation and control. The engagement photos showed everything she'd thrown away: two people building something meaningful together, supporting each other's professional goals, and making decisions based on shared values rather than external pressure or group consensus. Her friend's reaction to our engagement news was tellingly defensive and bitter, making nasty comments about how Iris looked too intellectual and serious, insisting that our happiness was performative and that relationships built on shared work projects inevitably failed once the novelty wore off. Brooklyn specifically claimed that I was probably boring Iris with the same methodical planning approach that had supposedly suffocated Hazel, while Scarlett insisted that career-focused women like Iris never stayed satisfied with domestic stability for long. But their transparent bitterness and desperate attempts to diminish our relationship finally triggered explosive confrontations where years of suppressed resentment surfaced, and Hazel accused them of never wanting her to be truly happy because her contentment threatened their shared narrative that all relationships eventually disappoint and that single women needed to protect each other from making serious commitments. The friend group imploded spectacularly when Hazel finally articulated what she'd been realizing for months, that Brooklyn, Scarlett, and Willow had systematically sabotaged every meaningful relationship she'd attempted because their own repeated failures made them resent seeing others achieve the stability and partnership they'd convinced themselves was impossible or undesirable. Iris and I had a beautiful eco-friendly wedding at Evergreen Sustainable Vineyard, a certified carbon-neutral venue outside Seattle that perfectly embodied our shared environmental values and commitment to making responsible choices even during major celebrations. The venue featured solar panels that powered the entire facility, rainwater collection systems that irrigated their organic grape cultivation, and buildings constructed from reclaimed timber that created a rustic elegance without environmental destruction. Our 70 guests included genuine friends and family who celebrated our partnership rather than questioning our compatibility, colleagues from both our professional networks who understood our shared passion for using technology to solve environmental problems, college friends who'd watched our relationship develop naturally through mutual interests, and family members who appreciated how well we complemented each other's strengths and supported each other's goals. The ceremony featured locally sourced flowers arranged in biodegradable planters that guests could take home to start their own gardens, catering from regional farms that used sustainable agriculture practices, and decorations made entirely from native Pacific Northwest plants that could be composted afterward rather than contributing to landfill waste. Our wedding favors were packets of indigenous wildflower seeds that guests could plant to support local pollinator populations, reflecting our belief that celebrations should contribute positively to the community rather than just consuming resources for temporary enjoyment. For our honeymoon, we spent 3 weeks exploring Iceland's renewable energy infrastructure while researching geothermal applications that could be adapted for urban planning projects, perfectly combining our professional interests with romantic adventure in ways that energized both our relationship and our career development. The trip included tours of geothermal power plants that supplied clean energy to entire cities, visits to research facilities studying sustainable aquaculture systems, and meetings with urban planners who'd successfully integrated renewable technology into historic city centers without compromising architectural integrity. We returned to Seattle with dozens of innovative ideas for collaborative projects and a deeper appreciation for how our individual expertise could combine to create solutions neither of us could develop alone. 6 months after the wedding, we established Chen Morrison Environmental Solutions, a consulting firm specializing in smart city applications that integrated my VR modeling capabilities with Iris's urban planning expertise to help municipal governments visualize and implement sustainable infrastructure upgrades. Our marriage thrived on mutual respect, shared professional goals, and genuine friendship that grew stronger with each project we completed together, creating exactly the stable foundation I'd always valued but Hazel's friends had convinced her to reject as boring and unambitious because they couldn't distinguish between healthy stability and stagnant complacency. 5 years after the Science Museum incident, I received an unexpected handwritten letter forwarded through my parents' address, written on quality stationery that immediately reminded me of Hazel's careful attention to meaningful details. She had tracked down my family's contact information through mutual college connections after realizing that reaching out directly might complicate my marriage or give her false hope about rekindling something that had ended definitively years earlier. The letter took complete responsibility for choosing her friend's jealous manipulation over genuine happiness, acknowledging that she'd destroyed something genuinely good because she'd been too insecure to trust her own feelings about our compatibility and shared goals. She explained that she'd completely severed contact with Brooklyn, Scarlett, and Willow after finally recognizing their pattern of sabotaging any relationship that threatened their shared narrative about love being temporary and disappointing, and that she'd been working through her people-pleasing issues with a therapist who'd helped her understand the difference between exciting dysfunction and mature love built on compatibility and mutual respect. The letter expressed sincere joy for my successful marriage to someone who clearly appreciated my qualities, mentioning specific details from our engagement photos that showed how naturally Iris and I collaborated on projects and supported each other's professional ambitions. Hazel wrote that seeing our genuine partnership had helped her understand what she'd actually lost at the museum, not just a boyfriend, but a person who'd valued her thoughts and dreams enough to spend months creating something meaningful that celebrated their shared journey together. I received the letter while Iris and I were designing our dream smart home with integrated renewable energy systems and a dedicated workshop for developing environmental VR applications, sitting in our shared office space surrounded by architectural plans and sustainability research that reflected everything we were building together. After discussing the letter with Iris, who appreciated Hazel's mature approach to closure and growth, we decided that her genuine accountability deserved acknowledgement while maintaining appropriate boundaries that protected our marriage from unnecessary complications. My sister Logan helped craft a brief response that thanked Hazel for her honesty and maturity while making it clear that we'd moved forward completely, creating the kind of carefully worded closure that recognized her personal development without opening doors for further communication. The note provided definitive closure for both of us. Hazel could find peace knowing that her apology had been received and accepted, while I could finally close that chapter completely, satisfied that she'd learned important lessons about trusting her own judgment instead of deferring to toxic influences that prioritize drama over genuine happiness and personal growth.